I have made your name known to them, and will make it known." These words of Jesus, taken from the Gospel of John, chapter 17, verse 26, are regularly used by Jehovah's Witnesses to convince us that Jesus was making known to the people of his time that God's name is Jehovah. In this video, I'm going to explain what those words of Jesus really mean. But here's the twist. I'll do it using the witnesses' own publications. That way, I'll be killing 3 birds with 1 stone. On the one hand, I'll show what those words actually mean. At the same time, it will serve to illustrate how the leaders of the witnesses twist the meaning of Scripture, fully aware of what they're doing. And finally, it will show that rank-and-file Jehovah's Witnesses, most of the time, are unfamiliar with the content of their own publications. Let's get started. As I mentioned in the video on Leaving Up Here, the book that explains the meaning of John chapter 17, verse 26, is Insight on the Scriptures. But before quoting directly from that book, let me ask you a few questions that will help you better understand what we're about to read. Jesus said that he had made his Father's name known. So the question is, who did Jesus preach to? If you've read the Gospels, you know that Jesus was Jewish, and he preached to people from his own nation. It's true that on one occasion, while passing through Samaria, he preached to a woman by a well, but precisely because of that, it was an exceptional situation. In fact, it is written in Matthew chapter 15, verse 24. He answered, "I was not sent to anyone except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Now then, aren't we supposed to believe, according to the witnesses themselves, that the Israelites already knew that God's name is Jehovah? So then, in what way did Jesus make his Father's name known to the Israelites, if they already knew it beforehand? It would be like me telling you, "I want to let you know that your father's name is Henry." You would probably respond, "What are you talking about? How are you going to tell me something I already know?" The exact same thing applies to the Israelites in Jesus' time. If, just as the witnesses claim, the Israelites already knew the name Jehovah, then how could Jesus be making it known to them? The answer actually comes from the Jehovah's Witnesses' own literature that most of them don't read, including elders. In the book Insight on the Scriptures, under the topic Name, it says the following. When Jesus Christ was on earth, he made his Father's name manifest to his disciples. Although having earlier known that name and being familiar with God's activities as recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures, these disciples came to know Jehovah in a far better and grander way. One more time. Although having earlier known that name and being familiar with God's activities as recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures, these disciples came to know Jehovah in a far better and grander way. This would be the direct answer. But to understand it better, let's go a few paragraphs earlier than the one I'm quoting, while still staying within the same topic, name, in the book Insight on the Scriptures. It says the following. For an individual to know God's name signifies more than a mere acquaintance with the Word. Again, for an individual to know God's name signifies more than a mere acquaintance with the Word. It means actually knowing the person, his purposes, activities, and qualities as revealed in his Word. Let me put it in another context. If I tell you, Natalie has a good name, what am I trying to say? Exactly. I'm telling you that Natalie has a good reputation. A person's name is synonymous with their reputation. Biblically, this meaning of the term name is clearly explained in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 1. A good name is to be chosen rather than great wealth. To be respected is better than silver and gold. As you can see, biblically, just like in everyday language, the term name is essentially someone's reputation. So no, my Jehovah's Witness friend, according to your own publications, Jesus did not come to teach the Israelites that God's name was Jehovah, because they already knew that. What he actually did was teach his disciples what that name truly meant. When you read the Gospels, it becomes clear that the Jews did not have a very accurate understanding of the Father's true reputation or character. Their religious leaders had them confused with an endless set of rules, some of them downright absurd. For example, a passage we constantly refer to on this channel is Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. I'm talking about the moment when Jesus healed a woman on the Sabbath, a woman who had been suffering for 18 years. Let's remember that in that passage, we're told that the synagogue leader rebuked the crowd that was seeking healing on the sacred day of rest. It's clear that, for the synagogue leader, God was only interested in people following rules rigidly. But the God Jesus preached was very different. He was someone who felt compassion for that woman's suffering and believed she deserved to be healed, regardless of the fact that it was the Sabbath. The God of Jesus was a God for whom human health and life came first, before the rigid observance of rules. And by the way, the God of the witnesses looks a lot more like the synagogue leader's God than the God of Jesus. The God of the witnesses would rather you die than receive a blood transfusion. It's clear that the God Jesus revealed would never allow that. But getting back to the point, the Jewish religious leaders were not teaching people a God of love. They were teaching a legalistic one. The God of Jesus, on the other hand, was a God of love. That is the name of God, or God's reputation, or if you prefer, God's character, that Jesus made known. And to see this clearly, I invite you to read the full passage we've been discussing, John chapter 17, verse 26. I have made your name known to them, and will make it known, so that the love with which you loved me may be in them, and I in union with them. Do you see how Jesus connected knowing God's name with love? In other words, if you want to show that you truly know God's name, love your neighbor. In other words, if Jehovah's Witnesses truly knew God's name, in the full sense of the expression, they would behave in a loving way. They would have chosen to protect children instead of protecting their reputation. They would prioritize human life and health over rules, especially when it comes to blood transfusions. They would pay their workers fairly and compensate them when, after decades, they stop working for them, and so on, and so on. And let it be clear, everything we've reflected on here is based on the Jehovah's Witnesses' own publication. So why is it that in other publications, the leaders of Jehovah's Witnesses give a different explanation? As in many other cases, this speaks to the hypocrisy that governs the actions of their leaders. One thing is the in-depth study material that, at one point, some writers included in the book Insight on the Scriptures, as well as its predecessor, Aid to Bible Understanding, material that is not always read by the average Jehovah's Witness. And another thing is the indoctrination-oriented information that usually appears in the Watchtower magazines that witnesses study on weekends in their kingdom halls. Same Bible, same Watchtower society, different authors, and a different purpose, depending on the case. By the way, if you're enjoying this podcast, give it a like, share it with someone who might benefit from it, subscribe if you haven't already, and click the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. You can also join the channel membership. That way, you'll get access to special content where I can speak more openly about sensitive topics. Click the link in the description. And to those who have already joined, thank you. Your support makes it possible to keep creating this content. Let's continue. I can't close this video without mentioning other important aspects related to the limited interpretation some witnesses give to texts like the one we've been analyzing, where Jesus said he made his Father's name known, or the expression found in the prayer he taught, when he said, "Let your name be sanctified." I'm referring to the fact that, as Jehovah's Witnesses themselves admit, Jehovah is not the correct pronunciation of the Tetragrammaton, the 4 Hebrew consonants that represent God's name in biblical Hebrew. In fact, in each country, witnesses pronounce it differently depending on the language, and in their own publications they acknowledge that most scholars agree that the pronunciation Yahweh is closer to the original. On the other hand, it's important to point out that the Jehovah's Witnesses Bible, the New World Translation, uses the name Jehovah in the New Testament, even though the reality is that, among the hundreds of ancient Bible manuscripts that exist, the Tetragrammaton appears only in the Old Testament. There is not a single one that contains it in the New Testament. So if God's name does not appear in any of the existing ancient New Testament manuscripts, why do the witnesses include it in the New Testament of their Bible? For one simple reason. It fits the narrative that Joseph Franklin Rutherford began shaping in the early 1930s. In 1931, he decided to take a biblical passage, Isaiah chapter 43, verse 10, and use it to name his cult, Jehovah's Witnesses. From that point on, Mr. Rutherford appropriated the pronunciation Jehovah as a distinctive brand. Later, his successor, Nathan Homer Knorr, took it a step further in this appropriation of the Jehovah brand when he ordered that the name be included in one of their most ambitious projects, giving Jehovah's Witnesses their own Bible, the New World Translation. In other words, including the name Jehovah in the New Testament was an executive decision, one with no basis in the biblical manuscripts. Let's not forget that the organizational model of the Watchtower is entirely corporate in nature. The Jehovah brand is part of its business model, something distinct to offer within the religious marketplace. Would you like to go deeper into this topic? Click the video in the top right corner. And if you want to better understand the history of Jehovah's Witnesses, check out the playlist on leaving in the bottom right. See you.